I welcome the opportunity to talk about the Albanese government's energy policy failure. And what we've seen from this government is a trifecta of failure. They're failing to meet significant or make significant emissions reductions, they're failing to make electricity cheaper, and they're failing to make our energy system more reliable. Now, the first quarter after Labor came to office, quarterly emissions, as reported in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory for the June 2022 quarter, were 108.2 megatons of CO2 equivalent. The most recent quarter available, March 2024, almost 2 years later, quarterly emissions 109.7 megatons of CO2 equivalent. Emissions have gone up since Labor came to office. Compare this with the Coalition. When we came to office in 2013, annual emissions were 557 megatons of CO2 equivalent. When we left office in 2021, they were 438, a cumulative emissions reduction of 21%. What we've seen from Labor in terms of emissions reduction is a big donut, a zero. They promised lower emissions, but in fact emissions are increasing. Remember how many times the Labor government promised that electricity bills would be $275 cheaper on average by the end of 2025? Well, I think it was at least 92 occasions, wasn't it, by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese? At least 92. I stand to be corrected by those opposite. But instead what we've seen is double-digit increases in the retail prices of electricity and gas for each of the past 2 years, in the order of 15% annually for electricity and 25% annually for gas. So they promised lower power bills, but in fact power bills are increasing. And finally, the government's policies have failed to make our energy system more reliable. Just last week, the Australian Energy Market Operator, the regulator in this space, warned that the largest supplier of gas storage on the East Coast could run out of gas before the end of the year. I quote here, "The supply of gas in all or part of the East Coast gas system may be inadequate to meet demand." Now, with the continued closure of coal-fired power stations coupled with a greater dependence on intermittent forms of energy, our energy system is ever more dependent on gas to act as the swing producer. So if gas is running low, the stability of our electricity system in its entirety is in peril. We've seen Labor promise to make our energy system more reliable, but instead the security of our energy system is hanging by a thread. They promised lower emissions, but in fact emissions are increasing. They promised lower power bills, but in fact power bills are increasing. Now, Acting Deputy President, you'll be pleased to know there is an alternative, and it's one that the Coalition announced just last week, because we know that Labor's renewables-only approach is not reducing our emissions, is not reducing our prices, is not making our electricity system more reliable. The Coalition believes in a balanced energy mix, not a renewables-only approach, and that's why we've promised to pursue, if elected, zero-emissions nuclear power generation. Of the 20 most advanced economies, this is the G20, Australia is the only country either not using nuclear power or moving towards it. We will change that. With 90% of baseload power, predominantly coal-fired power stations, coming to an end of their life over the next decade, we need something, a non-intermittent form of energy, to replace them. And currently, large-scale storage is not up to the task. Now, Australians are currently paying some of the highest electricity prices anywhere in the world, upwards of 40 cents per kilowatt-hour. But in the province of Ontario, for instance, where nuclear provides 60% of the energy mix, electricity costs around 14 cents per kilowatt-hour, or 4 times less. How often do we hear in this debate that we need to listen to the science, to be guided by the experts? Well, here we have a power source that is validated by science, that is zero emissions, that is used reliably and commercially around the world, that more nations are embarking on, and in which Australia has some natural advantages. More than that, it would set up Australia for a whole new wave of industries and new technologies. What's not to like? But Labor doesn't want to touch this. They don't seem to think Australia is up for a sophisticated debate. They don't seem to think that Australia, which has had a functioning nuclear energy industry for over 60 years, has the capability or ambition to imagine an alternative future.